All right, well, welcome. Today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Andrew Bostom. Dr. Bostom is a academic, retired. He's going to tell us a story in a little bit. And it is, I found him on social media, as we find many people. I found Michelle on social media many years ago, and he has some pretty searing insights that are not conventional, that are not certainly towing the establishment line. He clearly has a mastery of data analysis that few have, and so he comes to independent, frequently frequently right, frequently correct, frequently proved correct assertions. So I wanted to bring him on, and I'm so happy that he agreed to come on such short notice. So Dr. Bostom, welcome.
Really nice to be with you.
Can you tell me? So tell me, and tell the audience a little bit about how it is you came to be here. You're an academic, and you have tell us what your path has been.
Yeah, so I actually was originally trained as a physical therapist, and then I got a master's in exercise physiology, and I kind of specialized in cardiopulmonary rehabilitation. I was doing a lot of exercise testing. I worked for a cardiac rehab program, and I decided I really wanted to go back to school, for medicine ultimately. And so I graduated from SUNY Downstate in 1990, and my wife and I were married during medical school, so we were in the couples match, and we wound up matching in Rhode Island, and we've been in Rhode Island, ever since. And I did my residency in internal medicine. I did something called clinical investigator pathway. Usually people do that, combine that with a lab experience. I was really interested in epidemiology, specifically cardiovascular disease epidemiology. So I wound up doing combined through as I was appointed to the public health service, and I asked to be assigned and was assigned to the Framingham Heart Study. So I worked at Framingham for several years, and that got me interested in. There was the whole, I don't know if you remember this, Anish. It was I'm a bit older, so the homocysteine hypothesis was very hot, and so there was a collaboration ongoing between the Framingham study and Tufts New England Medical Center, one of the key labs that was studying homocysteine and folate metabolism. And I got really interested in that. I wound up doing a clinical nutrition fellowship at Tufts New England Medical Center, which included, sort of the classical clinical ICU nutrition, but also allowed me to do a lot of research. And one thing led to another over the years when I continued my work when I was junior faculty at Brown, and I wound up I was particularly interested the way the homocysteine hypothesis evolved, and really I was in the right position when it came to testing it. I actually published a paper in 1999, which said, I think it was, I don't know if I can remember the title exactly, but it was something to the effect, homocysteine, important independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease or expensive creatinine, and because it was so intimately related to renal function. And so trials were getting underway in various populations for primary and secondary prevention of cardiovascular disease. And then, I don't know if you know about this, but the food supply was fortified with folic acid. And that really had an effect on population homocysteine levels, because folate is a key, actually co-substrate for homocysteine metabolism. And at any rate, a lot of the trials were being conducted against this background. And what I noticed is that patients with chronic kidney disease, even after the fortification, had persistently high levels of homocysteine because something was going on in relation to renal function and the elevation of homocysteine levels. So I said, well, these trials may be mooted by the fortification program. Why don't we design a trial in chronic kidney disease patients? And so one thing led to another, and it turned out that the easiest way to recruit patients was chronic kidney transplant recipients, because they had centralized care. And for what started out as an R01 with a lot of hard work, I was able to organize this into a big international trial that involved the US, Brazil, and Canada. And it wound up taking 10 years to complete this trial. But that fully funded me, for that period of time. And there were a lot of spin-off studies.
Yeah. So you're not just like a pseudo academic, right? You're not like an academic.
No, I certainly was a hardcore guy during that period,
Yeah,
but
no, no.
these things wax and wane, funding
No, no,
availability,
I know, I know. But you're a hardcore. You're clearly a hardcore guy. I mean, you're a hardcore gentleman that was in it. I mean, there's a lot of us that. No, I'm well removing myself from this. There are many folks who are at academic institutions, but they're not doing. They've never sniffed an R01 award and stuff.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
You have. I mean, you're like, you're like a bona fide academic. You chose academia.
I did.
You were fully R01 funded, and you were, basically an academic at Brown for about 25 years, correct?
Right.
And this was in the Department of
although the most fun I had, honestly, and that's why I really enjoy speaking to you as a cardiologist. The most fun I had by far was when I was able to run a small cardiac rehab program as a physician, no longer as a physical therapist.
Okay.
That was the most enjoyable, showing up, 4 or 5 days a week at a sort of Y-like facility, in the morning to be with it was predominantly men. I'm not trying to be chauvinistic, but it was predominantly men, and engaging with them on a day-to-day basis. And also the one thing that I always liked about cardiac rehab was that you could really see if problems came up. If people who were doing well, but then there were people who were not doing well, and it was a great sort of clinical laboratory for that. And we helped some folks and got them treated perhaps earlier than they might have been had they not been in rehab. But that was certainly the most fun that I had. It was much more fun than these ridiculous petty sort of rivalries that develop within the academy, the hardcore academy.
Well, you're well. You've unfortunately been on the front row of petty rivalries over the last few years.
Oh yes.
But I think it's really important because you're not some guy who slept at a Holiday Inn and read a chapter in epidemiology, and now you're suddenly like crunching numbers and saying all the stuff that you're saying.
Oh
about,
no.
But COVID and stuff. You are like a legitimate academic. R01 funded for most of his career, researcher.
But not in infectious disease. I'm going to be very clear about that.
Yeah,
this was all my area of expertise was in cardiovascular disease and chronic kidney disease epidemiology and clinical trials. So when COVID has been a big. I mean, I've read as voraciously as I could to get up to speed. To sort of basics about infectious disease epidemiology, et cetera. But I'm a newcomer to that domain.
Right. Of course. So yeah. So but nonetheless, when you have this established, you certainly have a lot of credibility when it comes to analyzing, large data sets, and pulling out, signal from noise. I mean, that's something that you've spent a lot.
Yeah. Not at a highly sophisticated statistical level. I always deferred to biostatisticians, worked with them, began to understand their outputs. If not, I had basic training in biostatistics. That wasn't a great strength of mine, but I'm familiar with the processes. That's for sure.
What was the first thing? I mean, when what was the first thing with this whole experience that we've gone through 2+ years of COVID and the pandemic and 2 weeks to flatten the curve? What was the first? When did you first start to think that there was something wrong with what, say, the establishment was kind of pushing?
I think it was very clear to me. So what initiated my skepticism about the way COVID was being presented. There was a seminal moment. I think it was when Rhode Island presented its model for what was going to happen with hospitalizations. And it was even covered on C-SPAN. The governor at the time was Gina Raimondo, who's now the Commerce Secretary. And the model was striking. I mean, they were predicting it's a very small state. I mean, they were predicting something like 4,300 hospitalizations that were going to peak at the end of April in the less conservative model, and something like around 2,500. I mean, we only have 2,000 beds in the whole state. I was and at the time they made this model, which was already in April, I mean, the hospitalizations were way below that, and I was like, how is this possibly going to happen? This seems exaggerated, if not wildly exaggerated. And of course, over the intervening weeks, so from like mid-April to the end of April, at the end of April to say the first few days in May, I think we peaked at that point at less than 400 hospitalizations. And so I had become friendly with someone who used to be the editorial page editor, and actually was until the end of this period. And his name is Ed Acorn. He's very well known for the Providence Journal. And I said, Ed, something's not right about this. I'm watching the counts every day. I'm looking at this model. If I kind of brought you up to speed, could you still in your last days as the editorial page editor, could you maybe write an op-ed? Could you find out who's responsible for the models and everything? And he's a wonderful writer who's now actually become a Lincoln historian, and he's retired from journalism, and he's a very good historical essayist and writes full books. And he did a very good job, very succinctly, and questioned the Department of Health and Brown University. And they gave him very little information, but at least he learned that it was a collaborative effort between the Department of Health and Brown University. And I remember he had some line in there, because Ed has a nice sense of humor, that the state wasn't charged any money for the model. And Ed said, well, the state certainly got its money's worth, and it was just wildly off, Anish. And that's sort of what got me going, like, how could you? And there was no mea culpa afterwards. So the curve, starts coming down slowly in May and everything, but it peaked at, I think it was just under 400. And they had said it could have been 10 times that much. And there was never any discussion, any form of mea culpa about why was the modeling, so far off, and what does this say about how the model was built, and nothing. There was just no comment whatsoever. And I guess that was my first experience that something is really gone awry here,
Right. Yeah. So and no, I mean, all of us were kind of stunned with what people were saying, what the models were saying, and it very quickly became obvious that those models weren't based in reality. Now, is that because you have some bias against? I remember me and Michelle too. We were frequently called Flubertarians because I was just aghast at the idea that you could stop the economy. I mean, in order to stop the U.S. economy for longer than 2 weeks, I thought you would need like a nuclear war. I mean, otherwise it's like dropping a nuclear bomb on each of your cities. And it's like, why does anyone need to drop a nuclear bomb on your country if you do it yourself? Exactly. when you're in this war. And so to me, that was my kind of fundamental bias, because it was like, oh my God, like how can you stop the economy? Like, to me, that the lifeblood of society is the economy, and that kind of is my bias. I don't think it comes from being in medicine or whatnot, but we were dismissed as like Flubertarians
well, that was another concern right away. And again, my friend Ed Acorn was like, wait a minute, if you're gonna if these models are wrong, and you're doing these draconian restrictions and lockdowns and shutdowns of the economy, that's going to be a lot worse than the fallout from that. In terms of health, is going to be a lot worse than anything you might have prevented, if you prevented anything by doing these lockdowns. Yeah, that was a concern. And I guess the next thing, Anish, that upset me was seeing very quickly how benign the disease was, particularly in children, and the whole controversy about closing down schools and remote learning, And then I remember when, gosh, I'm forgetting the first author's name, but he was a very soft-spoken Swede who was both a pediatrician and an epidemiologist, and he wrote a research letter that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, I think early in June of 2020. And he basically had already encapsulated the Swedish experience, certainly in schools. The schools were kept open up to age 16.
Yep.
They hadn't had a single pediatric death. Teachers as an occupation were not experiencing more, infections and certainly any more serious infectious morbidity. And then what happened to him, I don't know if you remember this, Anish, is that he was viciously attacked by some colleagues in Sweden, but actually by internationally, including people from the United States. And he came out and made a public statement. He will never research COVID again. He's never experienced anything like this, and he will never research any matter that relates to COVID again. And I was like, this is just appalling. That was an early, an early indicator of.
Was that a surprise for you? Was it like a shock that this?
It was a shock. It was a shock. I mean, he was just a good clinician epidemiologist reporting what they found. I mean, they didn't know it was going to turn out. I mean, it was so reassuring, and they stuck their neck out because they had a feeling, that this was a milder illness in school, and also that there were ramifications that were terrible for closing schools down for children, and so they did it, and despite their own trepidations and of course all the calumnies that were leveled at them, they were right. And he just published the findings, and then he was attacked.
No, but my question is, was it a shock to you that the Academy is capable of calumny and that sort of thing? I mean, you lived it for a couple of decades,
right?
And
right. Well, I knew it was capable for other things, because I didn't mention this, but it wasn't. I guess it actually could be a relevant thing to bring in. I mean, I was used to being attacked because I had the temerity. When things were more settled in my career academically, and 9/11 happened, I guess I have a little bit of ADHD, and I actually got very seriously involved in the study of Islam, and I was used to being attacked for my non-medical writings on Islam. That was very familiar to me. So yes, in that sense, I did have an inkling of how the Academy could behave, but I guess hadn't paid enough attention to how those same patterns of behavior happened in what was my primary occupation as an academic in medicine. I just was kind of oblivious to it. I really, so it was a shock again, but then I noticed certain patterns that I had experienced just from my other academic work, because I wound up doing very academic work on Islam and, studying the Sharia very carefully, studying the treatment of non-Muslim minorities, and so I was used to it, but in that domain, I really must have had blinders on in terms of what goes on in medicine, other than sort of pettiness.
Right. But the pettiness, I mean, I don't know if it seems to be more than just pettiness. Because,
absolutely now.
Right. I mean, right now, but even that, I mean, I don't have much. I didn't have a career as an academic, but I had some interest maybe in considering an academic career. I did my training at a UCSF, sort of a high profile, right, academically, and even in my residency, it wasn't as prestigious of a university, but nevertheless. And so I had experiences as a resident, as a medical student, as a resident, as a fellow, and then I could see how these people behave in academia. And I concluded that I didn't want to have anything to do with it. That these were in general people that were, I mean, there were people that I liked, some people I respected and whatnot, but in general, it was, it didn't inspire confidence in me. Right? That academia, in a way, was a place where people could lie, could backstab. Right. As fellows, we're frequently privy to infightings between faculty, right? Wow, so faculty would sort of badmouth the other guy, and
I saw some of that, Michelle. I just thought
right.
It was very petty, and also I was just very focused on trying to accomplish what I wanted to accomplish. The hell with what was going on around me.
Right.
But but yeah, but I'll tell you what I was totally blind to. Other than I guess I got an inkling of it, because there was a pathologist that had actually come up with the quote unquote homocysteine hypothesis of arteriosclerosis, named Kilmer McCauley, who was the dear man. But I loved Kim, and I used to go to the Providence VA where he was sort of exiled, from Harvard. And he would tell me stories about what happened to him, because originally, he had described some of the was amongst the people who were early to describe in the 1960s the first cases of homocystinuria, which was the fulminant form of hyperhomocystinemia, which really had clinical consequences, particularly thrombosis, lens dislocations. It was a rare syndrome, but it was real. But when Kim came up with a hypothesis, along the lines of the cholesterol hypothesis, that going from familial hypercholesterolemia to sort of the Brown and Goldstein idea, more of a continuum.
Right.
He was viciously attacked just for putting the hypothesis out and exiled. But and I saw that, and I thought that was terribly unfair and kind of ridiculous. But it just seems to be on another level now when it comes to COVID. I mean, but in retrospect, you could see that pattern of behavior getting ratcheted up. And also, I have to say, I am openly, politically conservative. That I learned very quickly in the academy. It is almost monolithically to the left, and so that creates certain problems as well that I think clearly you see with COVID. But I think there are plenty of other issues now too that you see it with.
Is there something about being conservative that
well, libertarian, I don't know, because like
no, I know conservative libertarian, meaning not progressive left or what have you. Is that the ideology? Is that the bias? Is that can you say is that
I don't know whether I was just like hyper focused or just plain dumb, but I mean, I was partly in that milieu, and I wasn't really political. I didn't object to it though.
Yeah.
But when I became more politically conservative myself, wow, it was very, very recognizable that if you don't toe the line purely on a political level, you could be in big trouble. And so. But it's just another form of groupthink, even some people are able to separate it out from their day-to-day work, but a lot of increasingly I noticed towards the end of my academic career that it was impossible for these people, that if you weren't with them politically, they would make your life miserable at work too.
Right. When did that happen for you, curiously?
I guess, well, and then I've never been a shrinking violet. I was, well, I will give you this anecdote which stuck in my mind. So by the time that Senator Obama was elected president, I was a conservative. I thought it was a momentous occasion for the country. I just didn't like his politics. I didn't vote for him. Not that McCain was better. I mean, maybe worse in certain ways. I didn't vote for him. But I was really happy to just celebrate the inauguration of an African American as president, and what that represented in terms of, I thought naively, race healing. It's worse. It's horrible now. It's worse than my lifetime. But at the moment, even though I disagreed with him politically, it was I wanted to see the inauguration, and so we had a shared room where there was a Keurig coffee maker and a big flat screen TV, and some of your whatever hospital dues went into that, and there was a physician's room. So I went down there like so many other people. I wanted to watch the inauguration, and I don't know if you recall, Anish, at the time. Dick Cheney was on a bridge device. He was on a ventricular assist device, but awaiting a transplant. So he was obviously not very well. And they had a ramp he had to be wheeled up because he wanted to be there to show the transition of power. And this stood out. I'll never forget this. There was a woman who just, contorting her face. It turned out she was a pediatrician, a way to learn, who said, "Throw him off the ramp," as they're wheeling this. And I just looked at her and I just walked out. I just, and then fast forward to Trump's inauguration, and with all his many defects, and I grew up, near, I knew him since I was a kid. I grew up in Queens where he grew up, and he's a complex guy. He's all the bad things you see, but he's also he has a very decent and generous heart. And I was able to see all kinds of acts of charity that he did behind the scenes, and he was also a schmuck. I mean, there was this. It's not, I've had a very ambivalent feeling about him. But by the time he was elected, I was very much for the change that he represented. And so thinking back on the inauguration of Obama, I went to Renal Grand Rounds, and I was wearing a MAGA hat because Grand Rounds was literally during the inauguration. So I have an earpiece in with one ear out. So I'm listening to the Grand Rounds, and I'm listening to his inauguration speech, which actually I thought was a very good speech. And I'm in the doorway. It's just kind of a small room, and and people. One guy turned around and saw the MAGA hat, and then all the heads are like turning around, and one guy said, "He voted for him." 6 months later, I was out of there, and it was not very pleasant. But I had enough friends in the system. I got reappointed. I had to get reappointed in family medicine. That's just the way things work. That's all I can tell you. And talking about what Michelle was bringing up about how vicious people can be.
Wait a second. So
I was eased out at that point. There were funding issues too, Anish. It wasn't clear cut, but that was the catalyst. I'm convinced. Things really went downhill after that.
That was 2016.
Yeah. So that's why I wound up in family medicine, and the head of family medicine. He knew the score, and he was a man of the left too. But he just said, "This is just out of control. You don't do this to someone, who's been in your division for all these years and everything. I don't care what his politics are." So I actually lost my appointment in medicine for a period of time, and so he reappointed me in family medicine at the same level. So.
Okay. Oh boy. Oh, that's a whole different. We weren't expecting to talk about that, but that's fascinating.
Yeah, it was. But it was. I actually, I took it in stride. I thought it was. I was quite angry at the time, but in retrospect, I mean, it just fit in. I mean, the whole sort of symmetry between watching the inauguration of Obama, again, which I wasn't for him, but I appreciated the historical moment, and then. Someone who, for better or for worse, I was actually happy with, in what he represented, and I was trying to just celebrate in my own way, and the reaction to it was just so incredible.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, you're right. And the rules just changed so much. You can say, for 4 years, you could say, "Not my president," blah, blah.
Right.
And then the moment you say anything like, you cannot say that about this. I mean, that's, my God, are you questioning the legitimacy of the
election?
Are you a seditionist?
Are you an insurrectionist?
Are you an insurrectionist? Were you at the Capitol on January 6th?
Exactly.
Your picture,
Actually, it's so funny. Actually, my friend's wife, went to hear his speech, and she just, thank God, she didn't go to the Capitol. She was kind of done after the speech.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, she could be in jail in like this sort of gulag state that they have for them now. I
know, right. So anyway, we have to have you back to talk more about politics and medicine. But no. So fast forward. So
sure.
This whole thing unwinds, and we lock down for 2 weeks to the 12th power or whatever, exactly. and then the vaccines. The vaccines come out. Your feelings on the rapid rollout of the vaccines?
I was a little concerned, and. I was also, I when Alex Berenson was obviously very, very concerned at the beginning, I thought that he was too concerned. But, more and more, I began I began to share his concerns, and see that, even though, like everyone else, he like all of us, he was prone to certain kinds of exaggeration, that he basically got the story right. And I guess that the first time that became clear to me, and I wound up collaborating with this pathologist. I think I sent you something that I had written with Claire Craig. Claire and I became friendly through another physician I knew in the UK, and she told me to go take a look at the raw data that came out of Brown from a nursing. So there was a senior investigator that I've known for years at Brown, very good investigator, Vince Moore, and he's always had access to these big nursing home data sets. And so he published a research letter in the New England Journal of Medicine very early on. I think the period of observation ended in March of 2021, and it was from one of the nursing home cohorts that he followed. And it was a very straightforward observational study, and they looked at the vaccinees and those who had been unvaccinated in this early window period after the introduction of the vaccine, and they were looking just really at infections. And what Claire pointed out to me is that, yeah, their primary analysis is like a vaccine trial analysis. You got a censor until they get fully vaccinated. She said, but Andy, just look at the raw tables from the point of injection and then non-injection. So the just the way you would do a randomized trial, it's at the beginning, not some arbitrary period where you were developing immunity, et cetera, et cetera. And she was absolutely, there were the same number of infections. And this was in nursing home patients early on. And I was like, wow. I was like, first of all, again, not being an infectious disease trialist, I was like, is this necessarily the proper way, certainly in an observational study, to even do the analysis? And then, Claire, as a pathologist, she said, why don't you read the literature about going back 40 years about the hypothesis that there's a period of vulnerability with all kinds of vaccines after the initial inoculation, and that there's changes in white cell counts, et cetera, which suggest that persons are vulnerable. And I said, well, yeah, that literature is out there. I said, so then why don't they just do time zero analysis? Because isn't that very important? I mean, that is the real world. And so that, I guess it was that experience, Anish, that got me a little skeptical about how these trials were designed, about how they were reported, is that they should be like any other clinical trial, whether it's a nutraceutical like I was using or a drug.
So Andy, clarify for me, because I'm not at all familiar with that aspect. The pivotal clinical trials for those vaccines were done precisely with this sort of starting point, like 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, and that's when the data was analyzed, and that's when
that's the way I understand it. That's the way I understand it.
But it's also understandable. Again, I'm not infectious disease, but it's also understandable that it's not unreasonable, I think, to have some type of period because where you would blank out, because obviously it doesn't matter. I mean, if you have a bunch of or I think it's probably best to report it all.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Report it all, but what you don't want to do is, like, if you have like a bunch of infections after the vaccine in the first, say, 7 days or 10 days, right? You kind of muddy the water. It does muddy the waters a little bit.
But when you start going out 3 weeks or 35 days, and again, it's these at this stage, it's not in an historical vacuum where you don't have a literature that says, look, with a whole gamut of vaccines, there appears to be a vulnerable period where there's things that are going on biologically, not just random events. That could contribute to a sort of transient period of immunosuppression. And if that's what's happening in the real world, then that's how we should analyze it as well. And that was Claire's point as a pathologist. And I said, there's something to it, but I agree with you if you at least report the data both ways. Which by the way, Anish, someone at the FDA, I mean, even the FDA, finally got fed up enough, I think, with Pfizer. So if you notice, the less than 5-year-olds trial, that's how they reported it. they reported it from time zero.
No, I mean, you're right. That's a very fair point. I see both points. I think what they should have done is kind of reported and put the data in there so that it could be parsed. But I think everyone is constantly trying to dumb things down to come up with some beautiful answer that the vaccine is some amazing, the holy grail or whatever. And I think maybe that's why they just felt like they couldn't trust it, because people would then attack it. But you're completely right. I mean, we know, for instance, there's a suspicion that your immunity is suppressed a little bit early on after. That's why we think there's more shingles cases, in that first period of time after the vaccine and stuff. Yeah, I guess that's something that the public should know. That's something physicians should know in terms of being able to inform patients, right? If you don't put that in the trial, in the NHM trial results, then in the paper that all the clinicians are reading, then that seems to be a problem. That's not going to lead to long-term trust. I feel like that's a huge problem for the people that are kind of like, the puppet masters, if you will. It's like, you guys are doing these things that in the short term, maybe it'll be beneficial, but in the long term, my God, you're going to just engender a lot of mistrust. I mean, the Paxlovid thing was simple. It was similar, right? The Paxlovid stuff in the FDA documents, you could see that there were a number of folks that were rebounding, right? That didn't make it into the NEJM that the clinicians were reading. So it is unfortunate how they went about doing it. But anyway, so those were your concerns in terms of the speed and how exactly the trial stuff was presented.
And then I had another local experience. So if you recall, Anish, that there was a series of the VITT events with the adenovirus vector vaccines, and in Europe, and then there were a number of cases that were reported in the United States. I remember there was one really tragic case of a healthy OBGYN. And they weren't common, but they were occurring because of the mass vaccination. And I was asked to comment on this, and actually wound up being interviewed for a half hour on the subject. And the first cases from Israel of the mRNA Myopericarditis Association were at least getting through the Israeli press. And so I gave a half-hour interview for a local station in Providence, television station, and I would say within a few hours of the interview being completed, there was Janssen made the announcement that they were having that temporary hiatus on the vaccine. That whole interview, and it was just really dry as dry could be. They spiked it. And that gave me an inkling into how they were going to handle issues of the vaccine. I was really annoyed, because actually we almost missed our plane when I was going down to visit my mom, and one of my frequent trips down to visit my mom in Florida. And I rushed in this interview, and we barely made it to the airport on time, and then they spiked it. So that was another insight. And that must have been about towards the end of March, whenever the moratorium was announced, March of 2021. And that was another indicator to me that something's not right when the news media are so intimidated by just fact-based stories on, and it was clearly depicted as rare things, but serious things that were happening.
I don't know if you've seen those. They recirculated some clips from 60 Minutes from back in the 1970s, when was it the flu vaccine that was introduced? The swine flu, right? And there was the Guillain-Barré, right? Correct. Yeah. And it was the complete opposite, where the 60 Minutes was they were all over the story and questioning the public health establishment and all that stuff. And it's amazing. There was in 1977. I learned this when I was writing this long piece about the Brown University myopericarditis case that we're still trying to investigate. There was a brilliant essay published in the California Law Review that's become sort of a classic reference for informed consent in relation to vaccination.
and it was based on the debacle of the Guillain-Barré outcomes from the swine flu virus, and it turned out it was written by a third-year law student at Bolt Law, but it's still cited to this day. And the brilliant point that she makes, and the ethical point that she makes, is that it doesn't matter if the vaccine is mandated. That doesn't obviate the need for informed consent, because even with something like, and she gave the example of childhood vaccinations, like for polio, et cetera. She said you have to always give informed consent, because even if it's mandated, the parent can say, okay, it's mandated at this school, I don't want to enroll my kid at this school. I'm gonna homeschool. I'm gonna take this kid somewhere to some religious school or whatever it is where it's not mandated. And also the author of this law review said that the idea of mandating a vaccine doesn't obviate the need to go through very carefully all the even rare reactions that could occur with the vaccine. So, because I think somehow it's the idea that it's mandated is like, well, it's mandated, so how we don't really have to do a full informed consent. It's mandated anyway. What are you going to do? I just sense even that attitude, which to me is just crazy. It's just absolutely crazy. But here in 1977, a third-year law student laid this out in a paper that, again, is still cited to this day.
That is. Yeah, it's incredible. Did you, you've done a lot of, the next thing that happened, with this whole, VITT thing, and again, it's the same type of, as you're, described well, this idea that you can't say anything negative to harm the overall public trust, right? Of the vaccines. And then it came out, J&J was paused, and then there was a torrent of abuse directed at the CDC and stuff for pausing J&J. Before restarting it again.
Right.
Anyway, and then I guess the next thing that happened was, was vaccine myocarditis, was a signal of myocarditis that was happening after the mRNA vaccines, especially. When did you first? When did that first come to your attention?
It was the Israeli press.
Okay.
And then it was the Israeli Ministry of Health report. And I became friendly with Dave Zweig, who was in touch early on with the Israeli investigators, and he was actually asking my advice, and I said, well, it looks like there's a signal, but in terms of the myocarditis, I think you should be talking to a cardiologist, and he did eventually. And I said, but Dave, I think it's very important that he was actually interviewing. Because he was a proper journalist. He wasn't giving me his sources. It turned out he was interviewing Dr. Mavorak, who was actually the head of the task force in the Israeli Ministry of Health. And finally, when the story broke, he could name him. But he was telling me things like, they'd never seen anything like this before. Certainly on a seasonal basis, because I guess they had some seasonal data from myopericarditis, and it was just a spike that they had never seen before in Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem area. So that was it was early in the spring, I would say. And then the first report of a sort of a series broke. The Ministry of Health's investigation was broken by the Israeli press, but it wasn't until June that they came out with the formal report. But I do remember once again I was working with Claire, and it was by the end of June that we said, look, there was this experience with when after 9/11 with the the war on terror. The Army was concerned about exposure to smallpox, particularly, Saddam Hussein. And it's interesting, Anish, there was a lot of debate about that, political debate, because political sort of medical debate, because someone said, okay, yes, it's possible they could use smallpox, but how realistic is it really? And that was sort of a background debate. But in the meantime, they inoculated a whole, some thousands of servicemen. And they got a big signal of myocarditis. But one of the things they did was they studied and they did a comparison to flu vaccinees. They just routinely had them come in. I think it was 3 weeks after the vaccine. It's just a one inoculation, and they picked up a lot of troponin rises. Not in the flu vaccine, that was effectively the control, but in the smallpox vaccine. So all Claire and I said, and that paper was published, I don't think it got published until about 2015, but all Claire and I said was that, let's use the summer of 2021 as they were, bringing in the children to be vaccinated. Let's just have a pause on vaccinating children over the summer until there's a series of 1 month studies that could be done that mimicked what the Army had done with the smallpox signal to see, and they just used troponin. It was a very simple study, but we said, oh, well, you could add echoes. I don't know if MRIs would be so easy to do in all these kids, but troponin, ECGs, echoes maybe. And just do a 1 month study, in a huge cohort of children that are vaccinated versus unvaccinated, because you had a big population that wasn't vaccinated, and let's see what the incidence is. And so we just we put that out there. No one would publish it, so we published it at Lockdown Skeptics. Claire tried to get it published in the BMJ, and even they wouldn't take it. And so we said, oh, let's just get it out there. So we published it in Lockdown Skeptics, which of course then marginalized it. But we just thought this was a golden opportunity. There's all this money being thrown around. So, it'd be a simple thing to do, but of course it wasn't.
Yeah, no, it is really fascinating. The study that was done that you're talking about, it's always tough to know how to assess for subclinical myocarditis, right? Because myocarditis is a clinical diagnosis. I mean, I routinely have taken apart studies that involve imaging centers, academic imaging centers, taking healthy people recovered from COVID and doing random MRIs on them and finding some bright spots of uncertain significance, being like, oh, this is myocarditis, and it's like, no, that's not myocarditis. Literally, myocarditis has to have chest pain with myocardial damage, with supportive, imaging findings. So, so I think MRI, certainly imaging, MRI is I think much tougher, because I think there's tons and tons of MRI studies on healthy athletes and people post running marathons and stuff that show these weird spots that are here and there, and you don't know exactly what necessarily they mean. Now, troponins is super interesting because troponin represents, myocardial injury, myocardial damage, myocardial necrosis, and again, we are nervous, as we tell many of our ER colleagues or critical care colleagues that, please don't order a troponin unless there's some reason, because otherwise, we get these troponin elevations that are, above the 99% interval, and they're kind of the small low-lying things. The EKG looks okay. The patients are doing their thing, and it's like, you do an ultrasound, and you say, okay, this could be a type 2 MI, and I don't know exactly what to make of it. There's these studies that say that those people who have some enzyme spill are prognostically worse, but I just, they're also prognostically worse because the people that are spilling troponins are a different group than the ones that don't spill troponins. Anyway, it gets very, very hazy and messy and muddy. But that being said, checking, the smallpox vaccination experience, right, that was done in the military, that looked at the development of clinical myocarditis after getting the smallpox vaccine, right? I think among 1,000 or so smallpox vaccinees, but I think there were 4 that ultimately were diagnosed with myocarditis. But interestingly, there were a lot more. There were 30 some with smallpox who got the smallpox vaccine who didn't have any specific cardiac symptoms that had a 2-fold increase in their cardiac troponin,
right,
from baseline, because this was a study, so they had it pre and they had it post, and it raises the specter of, is there such a thing as subclinical myocarditis? Is it something we should be concerned about? I would think, I don't know, Michelle, I would think that especially in children, if you saw a twofold increase in baseline troponin before and say, two to 3 weeks after a vaccine,
and didn't see it in a control group at that point in the summer of 2021 that wasn't vaccinated, or saw whatever the random change is, in a non-vaccinated group, it would have been a very interesting study to have out there before resuming the mass vaccination or before starting the mass vaccination.
Right, and it's surprising because you had the signal of myocarditis that was pretty strong even in April, even though the CDC director and the CDC was like, "Oh, we don't see anything." But
Right.
I mean, it was pretty strong because you had this big peak after the second and not the first. So if it was random, temporally related to vaccines that myocarditis was occurring, why do you have this peak after the number 2 versus number 1?
And that was on top of the earlier Israeli experience too.
Yeah, no, and that's part of that Israeli experience is that yes, it's higher than background, but hey, that clustering after the second dose,
right?
That is kind of like your bell is like ringing, your spider sense is tingling away, saying, "Uh-oh, this is something that is a real signal of a vaccine event." But yeah, I mean, this idea of these, of subclinical myocarditis and what the significance of it is, I think it's concerning, Michelle, that if 2 weeks later, after kids have received a vaccine, that they have this twofold rise in troponins relative to controls. And I have no idea why, when you've known about this since April, right? Why would you not mandate somebody take a look at that, in some way or the other?
You're asking me?
Yeah. Because you don't need trials. Michelle is the man who needs no trials.
Correct. I don't need trials, but I'll tell you what I think about my vaccine-induced myocarditis in a moment. I think why don't we continue to hear what Andy has to say?
Okay.
About I'll because I want to play the devil's advocate a little bit later. I don't want to spoil it here.
So anyway, the vaccine market has clear signal, and then despite this clear signal for more than 14 months, you have the spectacle, the absolute spectacle of these college campuses mandating the vaccines to young, healthy men, knowing that the rates of myocarditis after Moderna especially are much, much higher. I mean, at the very least, give a nod to something and say, okay, we think Pfizer, or okay, we want to extend dose. But no, they just acted like they put their heads in the sand and acted like everything was hunky-dory, and we were going to go ahead with
is that my cue to speak about what happened in Brown? Yeah.
So tell me, and then you recently sent me something very interesting about what did you find out?
Yeah. So this is how the story evolved, and why I'll lead you up to something that made me uncomfortable for about a month, but then I just decided to just put it out. I was contacting an old colleague who'd been a cardiology fellow when I was doing internal medicine at Rhode Island Hospital, and he was a great fellow, and he was a very solid cardiologist. And I had heard that it turned out to be a false rumor that he had refused to get vaccinated and had lost his license. Now, this actually happened to a colleague of mine who's an oral surgeon, and it was completely ridiculous situation where he had been, infected. He had whopping antibody titers to COVID. He had Bell's palsy after a polyvalent flu vaccine not too long ago, and he had sought a medical exemption, which his personal physician gave him on the basis of he had immunity, and plus he'd had not too long ago Bell's palsy, and he was concerned if he got it again, that would be the end of his career as an oral surgeon. And the state wouldn't give him an exemption, and not only that, closed down his practice for 5 months. And now he's suing, and I think he's going to win. They allowed him to reopen after 5 months, but he lost his staff and whatever. So I was calling this old colleague because I had heard that he had been forced out as well. It turned out it was a completely bogus rumor, it was a mix-up of the same last name, perhaps, and that this guy was actually, if anything, kind of a vaccine enthusiast and was about to get his 4th shot or whatever. So we have this conversation that starts out that way, and then we were catching up, and I told him I was doing some adequacy work for kids in the state. I didn't like the way COVID was being handled by the state, particularly vis-a-vis children, and in relation to both masking and vaccination. And then the floodgates opened. I mean, where even though he's now retired, but he was on his way to retirement, and his group, or certainly him personally, was, as he put it, sporadically covering the Miriam Hospital, which is one of the flagship, Brown hospitals. He had come across 3 cases of vaccine-related myocarditis. One was an older person. I don't remember the age of the second case, if he even mentioned it. But then there was a pause, and there was then once again the floodgates open, and then he got very specific about this Brown University student volunteering at the Miriam Hospital. Troponin level, it was sky high. The parents obviously concerned that he had dealt with from, quote, down south. And it just threw me that this came out, the way it did. And, the next day I was just thinking about what to do, if anything, about it. The Rhode Island Hospital group, investigators that I knew, both the radiologist and the cardiologists, published a case series on the MR findings of 14 young men under 30 in Rhode Island who'd had myopericarditis or myocarditis after the vaccine. I'm sorry? Oh, after the vaccine. And that got me thinking, I've got to do something about this. And I contacted the cardiologist informant, and he said, yeah, he was on service, he believed, now in March of 2021. And then I said, well, okay, that's an outlier, because the kids in our state, the young people in our state in that age range did not have access to the vaccine until at least the middle of April. And that was just a trickle. And so if this kid presented in March, by the 3rd week of March, he got vaccinated in February. That would be a real outlier. Lo and behold, theirs had exactly such a person, a 20-year-old from Rhode Island in the data set, that had gotten vaccinated on February 26th and presented in the hospital 4 days after the second dose with chest pain on March 22nd. And there was everything else was like a month and a half to 2 months later. So it really stood out. I had been working with de-identified Rhode Island Department of Health hospitalization data with a wonderful data analyst, Josh Stevenson, who's worked with Tracy Beth Hogue and Ali Krug. And I said, Josh, is there any possibility we can find this independently in this other data set? And he spent the whole weekend working on it. And lo and behold, he pulled out a case, 20-year-old, white male. They don't give you dates, but they give you the month of hospitalization, March of 2021. And also the family was from Florida. And my informant had said the family called from down south. And the hospital was the Miriam Hospital. So that wasn't in theirs, but it was in the Rhode Island Department of Health. So a lot of circumstantial evidence. I have a dear friend whose son, she's a Brown graduate, and her son is a student there, and she had battles with them over the vaccine, and ultimately got him a religious exemption, although he too had been infected, and she wanted a medical exemption. They wouldn't give it, but they sort of grudgingly gave a religious exemption. And she wrote a letter to the president of Brown University, basically, summarizing in her own terms, what I had found. And was there any discussion about this in the Brown community privately? Had they had hospitalizations before the vaccines were available for COVID pneumonia? How many were there? Was there any sort of risk-benefit analysis that went into the decision to mass vaccinate? And she got an icy response. And to this day, she still thinks President Paxton is a friend of hers. Basically, we follow CDC guidelines. I wrote independently to the guy that's designated as the COVID czar, basically, for the campus, with details about this case and the same issues. How many COVID pneumonias were hospitalized, during this period before and after the vaccine, will they acknowledge this case based on the evidence that no response, whatsoever. So now it's basically in the hands of actual investigative journalists, none of whom are from Rhode Island because they won't investigate it. They won't do anything to challenge the narrative of the Department of Health or Brown University academics. So they won't even investigate this. Even when I turned over the materials that I had, including a transcript of the conversation and even a recording of the conversation. And but there are 2 Canadian reporters that are interested in this, and then a young reporter from the Epoch Times who is actually developing a much larger story, which will probably take him the whole summer, about all kinds of vaccine injuries on campuses, not even just confined to myopericarditis. So I don't know when he'll get his thing done, but he actually contacted my source and grilled him, because my source is like scared now and he doesn't really want to talk about this anymore. But there's hard, there's a recording, there's the transcript. And so he did at least confirm what he had said to me, to the Epoch Times reporter, but that won't be coming out anytime soon and will be part of a much larger series. So I'm hoping these 2 investigative reporters will question the hospital, will question Brown, will do what they can, because there are things that aren't HIPAA violations that can be done to tease this out, like find out from the Miriam Hospital volunteer department, did you actually have a Brown student volunteering during March of 2021? Yes or no? And so I think there's other ways to confirm this and go back to Brown. And ideally, what would I like to see? I'd like to see Brown acknowledge that this indeed happened. It happened on their watch. They have some regret about not discussing it with their own, community and engaging behind closed doors, Anish, right? Just in the Brown community. Why did they not discuss this and weigh what hospitalizations there were, if any? I don't think there were any. I mean, I think that would have been front page news in the Providence Journal if that had happened in relation to COVID pneumonia. I mean, it may be pie in the sky to right. Want that, but that's what I'd like to see.
The dean of public health at the time at Brown, who's been basically dean for
he's still dean, even though he's the COVID czar. Yeah.
Right. He's now the COVID czar of the White House, former dean, right. The concurrent dean of public health at Brown for most of the pandemic. I think he's been there.
Right.
It may have happened under his watch where, a student at Brown University, a volunteer, et cetera, the details that you described, had COVID myocarditis. The number you gave for the cardiologists who are listening, or for whoever and Michelle, the troponin was 45. This is an old troponin, old school troponin, correct?
Right.
Old troponin of 45. That is no joke.
Well, the other thing that's no joke, or it could be just a brief run, was that the discharge diagnosis from the RIDO, the Department of Health database, also had ventricular tachycardia on it as discharge diagnosis. Now, I don't know whether that was a 3-beat run that defined it, or whether it was much worse. It was sustained. I have no idea.
Right. We don't know. I would assume that if it was a sustained, then, well, anyway, that's all speculation. Yeah, right. So, but no, a troponin of 45. That there's nothing. There's no debating that's a significant event. And if that happened, and this is again in the with the larger context of what's happening, the Israeli signal, all that stuff, how then do you run around mandating a vaccine and not mandating a vaccine in college-age kids, and then not even mentioning the fact that there may be a differential in the rates of myocarditis for Pfizer versus Moderna?
I will tell you something else that was interesting to me. Just maybe it's unfair to Brown, but I did notice that they have this Department of Safety. If there's a holdup on campus, or if there is an arson, or even a suspicious package, an alert goes out to all the students, a de-identified alert that one of your classmates was the victim of arson, or was the victim of a hate crime, or something like that. And I'm like, give me a break. I mean, this is a little more significant than that. Again, within your own network, you could have put out some sort of de-identified thing. This case happened. One of your classmates was hospitalized. We're going to have a discussion about how we gauge risk benefit before we initiate this mass vaccination program. And oh, by the way, four unidentified classmates of yours have already been hospitalized for COVID pneumonia. So that's going to be part of the discussion too, folks.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, I don't know. Maybe see, that's now pie in the sky, but to me, that's the way you would have rationally approached this whole situation.
Right. Like have that discussion, and then allow parents and college age kids to kind of make that decision, but kind of not saying that it's real, to kind of dismiss it as these things are mild. All that was just not I think the right way to do things. And
they haven't acknowledged it to this day, Anish. They haven't acknowledged it to this, and in fact, Brown is one of the schools in Rhode Island. Two, fortunately, have changed their policy. The biggest school, which is the University of Rhode Island, the state school, and Providence College, which is also a large college, they've foregone vaccine mandates. Brown and four other schools are still insisting that the incoming freshman class, have 3 shots, have the primary series and a booster.
Michelle, this is sounding like shared decision making, my friend.
Well, right. Let me play devil's advocate here, because I'm entitled to play devil's advocate. Andy, you don't know this, but in 2019, not too long ago, like maybe just 1 year before the vaccine mandate, before COVID came about, in 2019, on this very podcast, we had a podcast on a debate on vaccine mandates. And do you know Dr. Brain on Twitter? He's sort of famous, Dr. Howard Brain, or Jonathan Howard. Jonathan Howard was he's a famous he's famous on the other side, on the pro-vaccine, pro-lockdown, pro-everything. He was on. There was a lawyer from a professor of law who an authority on vaccine mandates. Actually, again, 4 vaccine mandates.
Okay.
And Anish Koka took their side. So it was basically me against these 3, full-on vaccine mandate. There was not a mandate that Anish was not in favor of before COVID. So here I'm entitled to play the devil's advocate a little bit. Okay. So how many people have died? Any documented case of death from myocarditis after COVID vaccine?
Yeah, I was able to find 4 autopsy reports. Actually 4 autopsy reports. One of them in the U.S. was 2 autopsies where they confirmed that it was a myocarditis post-vaccine death. There was another.
Are these published cases where you?
Published. Published. One, actually, the 2 the joint were in adolescents. Whereas I guess it's the flagship journal of the American Pathology Association, Archives of Clinical and Laboratory Medicine, or something like that.
Okay.
They published 2 autopsies in adolescents. There was a New England Journal letter which included endomyocardial biopsy data and an autopsy. That was kind of an odd combination. The biopsy patient survived. The autopsy patient did not. There was another case that was published from I think it was Korea, and I forget what the 4th report was, but I did identify 4 autopsy studies where the pathologists were convinced that these were vaccine deaths.
Okay, but thousands, presumably, of otherwise, recovered vaccine myocarditis injuries, of people who are fully recovered, and as far as we can tell, are doing okay. Because the majority of the reported cases are people who, spend 2-3 days in the hospital and then are discharged home. Right.
But the only thing I've seen in terms of long-term follow-up, and again, this I defer to you guys, but there is some persistence up to 8 months out of late gadolinium enhancement. I haven't seen. What I haven't seen is the kind of reassuring data that the Army published in 2003 or 4 after the smallpox.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, they didn't have MR, but what they exercise tested all of them. and or like 95% of them, something like 67 out of 69, and they had completely normal exercise tolerance tests at I think it was a median of about 8 months.
Right.
That was pretty reassuring to me. You know,
but what's the chance that they could do the same if they did it, that they could do the same?
They could.
They could. I mean, the chance I think is pretty high that you would find sort of reassuring data. You do an exercise test 8 months later after these, 18-year-olds who develop myocarditis, right? I mean, I think the chance is pretty high. So
I certainly hope so. I hope it looks exactly.
And then, so if they do, then would you say, okay, then the mandates are fine? Go ahead and mandate it.
No.
Okay, all right. So why are we even debating the question of how many?
Right. No.
Right.
I mean, because remember, this may be the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I don't like ecological data, but it does sometimes. It's all you got. And if the first presentation, is arrhythmia, that can lead to sudden cardiac death, mm-hmm. as has been suggested from some of these EMS databases, like the one from Israel, I guess, that was published in Nature. That's another bad signal that I don't think we should have to deal with.
I'm sorry, the first presentation of vaccine-induced myocarditis is arrhythmia?
Well, if there's a subclinical phenomenon where there's arrhythmia or arrhythmogenic death, and
again, but I mean
I'm defer to you guys, because
right, but I mean the other side is saying listen, COVID is a bad thing. You have people who die of COVID as well. Right. But so I mean, how are you gonna
not in this age range? Not healthy young males. We're not seeing. Yeah. We're not seeing serious morbidity. We're not seeing. Right. Especially now, and it's a moving target. I
mean, let's suppose the rate of myocarditis, instead of being, let's say it's 1 in 3,000 or 1 in 5,000 with these vaccines. Let's say it's actually 1 in 10,000. Would that be acceptable? Or 1 in 50,000? Would that be acceptable if it was much more rare?
If the vaccine myocarditis,
right? If vaccine myocarditis was much more rare, would the mandates be okay?
No.
Right. Yeah.
no. I mean, it's not the only. I mean, we're focusing on this. It's a problem that's been identified, but there's a lot of other potential.
Yeah. So I mean, my point is that the people who are for mandates, they don't. I mean, it's a different logic. They don't care. I mean, and I think that you can make a reasonable case that these things are, at least severe consequences of vaccine-induced myocarditis is pretty rare. That there's a public health crisis. We have this pandemic. A lot of people are dying. We need to do something.
But what does it have to do with this low-risk population? That's what bothers me.
No. It doesn't matter, because they're at low risk, but they're also at low risk. I mean, the vaccine-induced myocarditis is not that common. I mean, somebody has to make a decision whether it's sufficiently common or not. Maybe. Right. So they say that 1 in 3,000, 1 in 5,000 with benign sequelae.
What I'm troubled with, Michelle, is what are they preventing? I don't understand what they're preventing. The vaccine doesn't prevent infection. It doesn't prevent transmission.
Right.
We're focusing sort of monomaniacally on myopericarditis. There are other things that are going on that don't look very kosher with in terms of potential problems. And just the idea that, I naively thought when the vaccines were rolled out that they were going to target the population that appeared to be at high risk. This is a very age stratified disease. And I thought that's what they were going to do. Oh, they were going to make it like Pneumovax.
Right.
All right, you're 65 plus, we'll offer it to you. You're 18 to 64, you've got diabetes, we'll offer it to you. I guess I'm very naive. I was just shocked at the whole mandatory nature of any of this.
But I mean, it's been going on since we've had vaccine mandates. I mean, it's been going on for 40 years, 50 years. That's why I was against vaccine. Well, that's why I was debating Anish before COVID against vaccine mandates in general, because I mean, all these decisions. I mean, somebody has to decide. What you're going to have a discussion? You said let's. Brown University should have had a conversation with the students and whatnot. I mean, at the end of the day, if it's a conversation about at what level of risk we're going to mandate, somebody has to make a decision.
Oh, no, I wasn't saying at what level of risk you're going to. No, I guess maybe you misunderstood.
No. I mean, I think I know you're against mandates in general, right. But I mean, the point should be that mandates should be out of the question. It should be
I
wrong,
see.
right? I mean, they should be wrong, and I don't care what level of risk or
Well, yeah.
whether, and trying to, now it's clear there's myocarditis. The CDC will, eventually admit it. But so long as the idea of mandate is accepted, if the idea of mandate is accepted, meaning MMR in schools, right? That's widely accepted. So long as that is widely accepted, then it's accepted that somebody has to make a decision. A public health authority has to make a decision as to when a mandate is called for. And you're going to have and that's, they're not going to ask my opinion or your opinion. They're going to decide. Right.
No, you're absolutely right.
So it's
it's more of a libertarian argument, and
it's not right. I mean, I'm not. Vaccine mandates are really fundamentally what they are. It's eugenics. It's eugenics. I mean, it's a eugenic theory.
It's a eugenic mindset.
It's a eugenic mindset. It's eugenic mindset that you want you want to create these better people, and the ones that are not as good because they haven't been vaccinated, they're undesirable and should be eliminated. Right. So it's a eugenic mindset, and that's how it should be viewed. Yeah. And that's why I don't get into the weeds of. I mean, I'm glad you guys. I mean, I'm chiding you. I think it's very important work what you do. It raises awareness about the stupidity of the public health establishment, but not just their stupidity, just the concept of public health, right? The idea that you have these people who are going to tell us what's good for us and so forth and whatnot, and mandate those vaccines. They're enamored with vaccines.
But Michel, are there? Yeah. I mean, again, because I'm not coming from an infectious disease background, but it seems to me as if we're dealing, when you're dealing with influenza and coronavirus on the one hand, where these are RNA viruses that are constantly mutating, where the vaccines do nothing really about transmission. It could be different than quote unquote more stable viruses of the past historically.
But it's not a game.
There is a difference, I think.
Public health is politics. Right. It's not a matter of rational conversation and finding the truth and whatnot. It's politics. So we allow them to mandate MMR vaccine. That means we allow them to mandate anything they want. I mean, that's the bottom line. And it's been proven correct to this day. I mean, to this day, Brown University is mandating their students to, and there's no major outcry. And I think.
So you're saying it's a conditioning effect.
Correct. I mean, I think until people really realize that it's. I mean, my point is that we should get away from the utilitarian calculus of X many percent, and whatnot. And it's I think it's a moral issue, and it should be framed in that way from the get-go. Not a moral in the libertarian sense, but as I said, moral in the anthropological sense. These are healthy human beings, and healthy human beings are good the way they are, and they can't be made better by, or they can be forced to inject things that they don't want to inject. No matter how good the vaccine is, because I don't want at the end of the day, some other vaccine to roll out and say, look, our rate of myocarditis are much less now, right? They're now 1 in 50,000. So, ergo, we should go ahead and mandate them. But
it's hard. It's hard when you because when you talk about smallpox and polio, there are such massive successes.
No, that's not true. I mean, I think the case could be made with polio as well. I mean, polio is also an epidemic that comes and goes for reasons that are unclear, right?
It's the case in New York now, apparently.
Right. In fact, the biggest, worldwide, the most common cause of polio right now is the polio vaccine.
Exactly.
So
that's a part of the success of it. Meaning, you had a disease that crippled children. You had a disease that scarred and disfigured.
Yeah, but if that's the case, people will voluntarily take it, right? They voluntarily take it. Whereas now this whole eugenic thing, herd immunity, which is what they wish to achieve with the vaccine.
Yeah.
is a eugenic mindset, as you said. It's a
But
eugenic
Michelle,
mindset. It's trying to change the herd into a better herd.
Yeah.
One of the things that got me in trouble with and I believe even affected my Twitter account, which we haven't talked about, but it's not really. I only bring it up in this sense that actually I don't think my tweet about the Israeli study on semen counts, which I basically quoted the title, and then said, well, but they didn't do boosters, and what would happen with boosters? That was it. Oh, you're gone. That's it. So I don't think that was what it was about. I think what it was about was 12 hours earlier. So that tweet had been up for over 48 hours. 12 hours immediately before I was suspended from Twitter. I had put up a tweet where Ashish Shah literally said this from the White House lawn. My brown colleague, and now the COVID czar from the White House lawn said, it was on the 20th, that 20th of June, that there quote hadn't been any serious adverse effects of the vaccines, and I tweeted out, I had the quote, and I said, this is Lysenkoism. You can't just get out on the White House lawn and make a categorical statement like that. 12 hours after that tweet, I was gone. So but bringing up the polio issue and childhood vaccination, Ja also wrote an op-ed where he literally compared smallpox vaccination polio vaccination in children to COVID vaccination in children. And so I wrote a piece back when he made this crazy pronouncement, saying, basically sort of along the lines of educating Ashish Shah. And I compared the polio trial, which was in total 1.8 million children.
Right.
And in the end, they prevented about 375 cases of crippling polio. Not that they didn't have their problems, where like not deactivating the virus enough and killing some kids in a developmental phase of this trial.
Right.
But they prevented 375 cases of crippling polio. At the time that he was writing his op-ed, there was the 5 to 11-year-old Pfizer trial, which I went through it. It prevented 13 cases of the sniffles.
Mm-hmm.
So 375 polio, crippling hospitalizations on the one hand prevented versus 13 cases of sniffles, and so that's but I'm saying there was a risk that was demonstrated in a true long-term. Well, not so much of the long term, the size and scope of that trial,
right?
Where you could actually look at clinical outcomes.
But great chatting with you. You are back on Twitter. I mean, you're famous. You're on famous because you were suspended from Twitter, and after Alex,
I'm like the Alex Berenson mini me or something.
I know you are. Yeah, Alex Berenson came back on. You now emerged at like Lazarus, and so your Twitter handle is for now.
At Andrew Bostom.
At Andrew Bostom, Bostom, M as in Mary, not N.
That's right.
And so definitely give him a follow for some super great insights on what's going on at the moment. So thanks so much, Dr. Bostom.
Thanks, Anish. Appreciate it. Bye, Michelle.
Bye.